Well, I'm joined now by the Community's Social Security and Equality Secretary, Angela Constance. Good evening to you.
Good evening.
Your poverty advisor says there, you heard her, that if you're serious about getting rid of inequality, taxes need to rise. Do you agree?
Well, firstly, let me say I really welcome the BBC's focus on tackling inequality and addressing poverty in Scotland this week. There is no silver bullet, but we must remember that poverty is not inevitable. And there's a really strong story about the work that's been undertaken in Scotland today to address poverty and inequality, not just by the Scottish Government, but also in the third and voluntary sector. And also there are more businesses in Scotland employing people on the living wage. In terms of Naomi Eisenstadt's policies and proposals around income tax, she prepared a very detailed report for the Scottish Government called Shifting the Curve, and she made eminently sensible proposals in that, in and around taxation, and the Scottish Government has taken those on board, and we are reforming the council tax, making it more progressive. We are asking higher rate taxpayers to forgo a tax cut. So some people in Scotland are paying a little bit more tax, but we also have to strive to protect those people on low and middle incomes. But
these measures, as many of our experts would argue, are tinkering round the edges, forgoing a tax cut. You know, playing around, you may say, with some of the higher rate tax bands is not reforming council tax. It's symbolic moves, perhaps, but it's nothing like the game-changing moves that are being suggested by your policy advisor.
Well, of course, Scotland doesn't have all the powers over taxation. We will have 25% of the taxation powers, and it is important that they're used proportionately, that they do indeed are more progressive, where we ask those to pay a bit more who are able to do so, but we almost always have to protect those in low and middle incomes.
May I ask you why, though? Why it has to be proportionate? I mean, I can understand what you're saying is you want to protect people in the middle, but the point being made is that if you really want to tackle this radically, you actually need a lot more people to hurt. And these people that will be hurt necessarily are further down the income brackets. Now, do you not accept that?
We would, of course, have more options in and around taxation if we had more powers in the taxation.
But you've got plenty of powers now.
We do have more powers, and it is important that we use all our powers, not just in taxation, but in terms of the new welfare powers.
But forgive me, you're not using them, though. That's the point.
Well, we are. And we are making progressive changes to council tax and existing power, and we are making very important changes in income tax, where we are balancing the needs of those on low and middle incomes who shouldn't be asked to pay twice for Westminster's austerity. I mean, these are the people with the most to lose. These are the people who are carrying the biggest burden in terms of austerity. But
is it... Sorry, I know I'm sounding as if I'm interrupting you. It's just so we can get through some of these points. Is there not a danger that you look as if you're blaming Westminster, which is perhaps the old game, the old message, when actually what is required of the Scottish Government now, according to our experts, is bold, imaginative moves of the sort that the cautious, incremental steps that the Scottish Government takes is not meeting really in any way at all?
Well, it is important that we continue to lay the blame for welfare cuts at the door of the Westminster Government, because those cuts are pushing more families, more children into poverty. And that, of course, makes our job in the Scottish Government harder, where we have to spend valuable resources, £100 million a year, not to lift people out of poverty, but to mitigate against the worst aspects of so-called welfare reform. But in terms of being bold, taxation is one very important aspect. But it was only a few weeks ago that we launched the Fairer Scotland Action Plan. Within that, we have bold, radical legislation to eradicate child poverty. We announced a £29 million fund for community organisations to tackle poverty at a very local level.
Do you think you can have economic growth and seriously reduce inequality? Because our expert, Professor David Bell, said that only in very, very limited conditions is that possible? And your government's committed to economic growth.
Well, actually, I mean, the international evidence would show that supporting and promoting economic growth goes hand in hand with tackling inequality and poverty. Inequality across the UK has been an absolute drag on economic growth. So the two things are two sides of the same coin, and tackling poverty and inequality is in all our interests. But in terms of bold, radical plans, the Fairer Scotland Action Plan is putting more money into communities, the £29 million new fund that I mentioned, legislation to eradicate child poverty by introducing radical income targets, acknowledging the income, that family income is the biggest driver of child poverty. We are indeed investing heavily in early learning and childcare, which has been described by Heriot-Watt University as possibly the single most important policy in tackling poverty and inequality.
One final question. Right now, the Finance Secretary, as you know, Derek Mackay, is preparing next month's budget. What's on your shopping list? What are you going to ask him to do that could seriously, not just tinker around the edges, not just laudable community moves, but seriously change that difference that there is between the haves and the have-nots in Scotland?
I think affordable housing remains a top priority for the Scottish Government, and it has to remain a top priority because you shouldn't look at it in isolation. So affordable housing helps hard-pressed families with more affordable rents. It also helps improve the health of families if people are in an energy-efficient, warm, dry home. And if it's an energy-efficient house, fuel bills will also be lower. And investment in housing is fundamental to growing our economy.
Andrea, Constance, thank you very much for joining us this evening.